The cashier ran my card a second time, and the little screen flashed the same word it had 30 seconds earlier: declined. Sorry, do you have another card? She asked, glancing past me at the line already forming. I felt my face go hot. A cart half full of groceries sat between us. Milk and produce I'd need to either pay for or abandon in the next 60 seconds. I stepped aside, pulled out my phone, and called my husband, my voice low, trying not to let the woman behind me hear the embarrassment in it. Desmond, I'm at the store and my card just got declined. Twice. Can you check if something's wrong with the account? There was a pause on the line long enough that I knew, before he even said a word, that this wasn't a bank error. I locked your credit card, he said, as calmly as if he were telling me what he wanted for dinner. What? I locked your credit card, he repeated. You won't be using it again until we have a conversation. Before I could answer, another voice pushed onto the call, his sister. From now on, you seek our consent before you spend a single dollar out of that account, she said. Every word dripping with satisfaction. I stood there in the cereal aisle, my cart of groceries abandoned behind me, and I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I told the cashier I'd have to leave my cart, apologized to the woman in line behind me, walked out to my car, and drove straight to my bank instead of home. 3 hours later, my phone showed 45 missed calls, and by then, everything they thought they controlled was already gone. This is Silent Revenge. If you're new here, hit subscribe now, because this story does not end where you think it's going to. Stay with me. I'm Vanessa Hale. I'm 42 years old, and until that afternoon, my husband and everyone else in our family believed I was the quiet one, the wife who kept the peace no matter what it cost her. For 17 years, that was mostly true. I met Desmond in our late 20s, when he was starting a small construction company with one used pickup truck and a toolbox that barely fit in the bed. I was finishing my CPA licensing exams. He admired my patience. I admired his confidence. Neither of us had much money starting out, but we built a real life together, brick by brick, the same way he built houses. I remember the early years vividly because they were genuinely happy in a way that makes everything that came later feel like a slow, quiet betrayal of what we'd once actually built. Desmond used to bring home scraps of lumber from job sites and build small, imperfect furniture for our first apartment. A wobbly bookshelf, a coffee table with a slightly uneven leg he was embarrassed by for years. I kept both pieces long after we could afford to replace them because they represented something I valued more than polish. Two people building something together from almost nothing, patiently, without either of us needing to be the one in charge. We married 3 years after we met. In a small backyard ceremony, neither of our families could have called extravagant. And I remember Desmond's toast that evening, raw and unpolished, thanking me for believing in a business that, at the time, barely had enough contracts to cover a single month's expenses. I believed in it because I believed in him. I never once imagined, standing in that backyard, that the same partnership we were building that day would eventually require me to quietly, secretly prop it up for years without him ever fully understanding the weight I was carrying. Over the years, his company grew steadily. So did my career. I became a certified public accountant, specializing in financial planning for medical practices. Nothing flashy, no company trucks with logos, no interviews in the local business paper, just spreadsheets, careful planning, and clients who trusted me with their futures. The income was excellent. Very few people, including Desmond, ever knew exactly how excellent, because I never felt the need to compare salaries. Marriage, to me, was never meant to be a competition. We raised 2 kids together. Maya was 16, thoughtful and sharp. Julian was 14, the kind of funny that made hard days feel lighter. Every financial decision I made, quietly, in the background, was built around giving them a future without unnecessary burdens. For years, Desmond appreciated that, or at least I believed he did. Then, everything slowly started to change. The change didn't begin with money. It began with his sister's divorce. Priya, Desmond's younger sister, had been married for 6 years when her husband left abruptly, taking most of their joint savings with him before she'd even had time to consult a lawyer. She had nowhere stable to go, and Desmond, without much discussion, offered our guest room. I agreed immediately. Family takes care of family. I believed that completely, and honestly, I still do. Understanding who Priya had been before all of this matters to understanding who she became in our house. She'd always been the more visibly ambitious of Desmond's siblings, a regional sales manager at a pharmaceutical company, someone who'd built her own identity around a certain kind of competent control, managing a territory, managing a team, managing a household she and her husband had built together over 6 years. Watching that entire structure collapse in a matter of weeks, her husband gone, her savings drained, her sense of authority over her own life suddenly obliterated, left her, I think now, desperate to find some version of control to hold on to again. I didn't understand that at the time. I only understood, months later, watching her slowly annex more and more of our household's decisions, that she'd found that control in our kitchen, at our dinner table, over decisions that were never actually hers to make. At first, it seemed like exactly the right thing to do. Priya was grateful, helpful, warm. She picked the kids up from school when our schedules got chaotic. She cooked dinner some nights just because she wanted to contribute. I remember genuinely loving having her around those first few months. Looking back, I think that was the last peaceful season our household ever had. If you've ever watched someone slowly stop being a guest in your home and start becoming an authority in it, stay with me, because you already know exactly where this story is headed. It started with harmless opinions. You let the kids stay up too late. You spend too much on organic groceries. Why buy name brand detergent when the store brand works fine? None of it bothered me much at first. Everyone has opinions. I smiled and moved on. Then the opinions became instructions. Then the instructions became rules. She started questioning birthday gifts, vacation plans, what I ordered at restaurants. One afternoon, she looked through my grocery bags before I'd even finished unloading the car. $28 for coffee beans? She asked, holding up the bag like evidence. They last almost a month, I told her. She shook her head. That's how people never build savings. I stood there thinking, I bought those with my own paycheck. Why does this concern you at all? But I let it go, the way I'd learned to let so many things go. Because peace always felt easier than confrontation. Peace, I would eventually learn, has a strange way of teaching controlling people that you'll accept even more. A few months later, Desmond suggested we simplify things into one household budget. It sounded reasonable. Married couples do it all the time, so I agreed. What I didn't fully register was how often Priya sat nearby during those conversations, sometimes not even pretending not to listen, eventually answering questions that were never directed at her. If you ask me, a wife doesn't really need her own separate spending money, she said once, and I laughed, assuming she was joking. She wasn't. When I mentioned it privately to Desmond, he gave me the same answer every time. She's been through a lot, Vanessa. She means well. Just let it go. Ignoring it got harder. I bought Maya a dress for her junior year homecoming. Nothing extravagant, just something she'd fallen in love with after saving her own birthday money for weeks. When Priya saw the receipt, she frowned. You spent that much? Maya quietly disappeared upstairs. She deserves something special, I said calmly. Priya looked at Desmond. See, this is exactly what I mean. Instead of defending me, he sighed and said, maybe she has a point. That hurt more than I let on. Not because of the dress, but because I understood, in that exact moment, that my husband had started seeing me through his sister's eyes instead of his own. I never stopped contributing, quietly, in the background, the way I always had. I handled our taxes every year. I adjusted our retirement accounts. I reviewed our insurance policies. When Desmond's business hit a slow season, I moved money around so payroll never once bounced. He never asked exactly how I managed it. He simply assumed it always worked itself out. Sometimes the people who benefit most from your sacrifices notice them the least. I want to mention one particular week during that stretch, because it illustrated, better than almost anything else, the exact gap between how strangers valued my expertise and how my own household had started to treat it. I spent 3 consecutive evenings that week helping a client, a young family physician who just opened her first solo practice, restructure crushing equipment debt that would have forced her to close within the year. I found her a refinancing path that saved her practice, and she called me afterward, in tears, telling me I'd just saved not only her business, but her entire family's financial future. I came home that same week to find Priya reorganizing my pantry for efficiency, rearranging spices I'd kept in a system that made sense to me for over a decade, without asking, because she'd apparently decided our kitchen, like our finances, could use her particular brand of improvement. I want to mention a conversation with a close friend, a fellow CPA named Beatrice, who I'd worked alongside for over a decade, because she was one of the only people who ever named what she was watching happen to me plainly, rather than simply sympathizing after the fact. About 8 months before that phone call, over lunch, during a slow week at the office, she asked me directly why I let Priya sit in on every financial conversation Desmond and I had. I gave her the same excuses I'd been telling myself for months, that Priya was going through a hard time, that it wasn't worth the tension it would cause to push back, that Desmond would eventually see the pattern himself without my needing to force the issue. "Vanessa," she said, setting down her coffee, "you manage the finances of 6-figure medical practices for a living. You catch discrepancies other accountants miss. If a client let an outside party sit in on every financial decision and slowly start making the calls, you'd tell them, immediately, that they'd lost control of their own business. I think the real question isn't whether you can see the pattern. I think it's whether you've convinced yourself that seeing it in your own life doesn't count the same way." I didn't have a good answer for her that day, and I drove home turning her question over for weeks, unable to fully shake it, though it would still be 8 more months before that phone call finally forced the issue into the open. Then came the laptop. Julian's old laptop finally died in the middle of a school project, and I drove him to the electronics store after work. Found a reliable model on a genuine sale, nothing extravagant, exactly what he needed. I paid with our household card without thinking twice. When we walked in carrying the box, Priya's eyes went straight to the receipt sticking out of the bag. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Neither of them told me what they'd decided to do about it. I found out 2 days later, standing in the cereal aisle with a cart half full of groceries, when my husband's lesson finally caught up with me at the worst possible moment. If you want to know exactly what I did in the 3 hours after that phone call, keep watching, because this is the part of the story people ask me to tell twice. The parking lot outside my bank looked exactly like it did every other Tuesday afternoon. I turned off the engine and checked my phone. A few missed calls already, Desmond mostly, the first ripples of what was coming, and set it face down on the passenger seat. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking into that building to solve someone else's financial problem. I was walking in to solve my own. The branch manager, Foster Whitcomb, greeted me before I even reached his office. We'd worked together for almost a decade, professionally, not socially, and he noticed my expression immediately. "You okay?" I smiled. "I've had better afternoons." He closed his office door. "What can I do for you?" "I need to separate my finances," I said. He didn't react with surprise. Bankers see divorces, business failures, family conflicts constantly. He simply nodded. "Let's go through everything carefully." That process felt genuinely methodical, and it mattered to me more than the paperwork itself. 17 years of financial history laid out across a desk, account by account, each one representing a decision I'd made quietly, on my own, without ever asking for anyone's permission or approval. There was something almost meditative about watching Foster type each request into his system, a specific, controlled clarity I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. This wasn't rage. It wasn't panic. It was simply, finally, action. We went through every account connected to my name. Some were joint, some were entirely mine, opened years before Desmond and I ever married. "I'd like to stop my paycheck from going into the joint account," I said. "Done. I'd like to stop the automatic transfers from my personal investment account." He looked up. "The monthly transfers." Yes. Those transfers had quietly kept our household stable more times than either Desmond or Priya ever realized. I never announced them. I never wanted credit. I just wanted stability. Then came my personal savings, my brokerage account, and the trust my late aunt had left me years earlier. Desmond knew I'd received an inheritance. He had no idea I'd invested nearly all of it instead of spending it, letting it grow quietly, patiently, the way real wealth actually grows. I'd like these completely separated from any household activity, I said. Foster nodded. Done. He turned the monitor toward me. There are also several personal guarantees attached to Desmond's business credit lines. I wasn't surprised. Years earlier, when his company was still young, I'd agreed to serve as an additional guarantor because my income strengthened the applications. It had made sense then. It felt different now. I'd like to remove myself wherever legally possible, I said. Almost 3 hours later, Foster handed me a folder. Everything that belongs solely to you is now completely independent. As I stood to leave, he said something I still think about. You've spent your career protecting other people's financial futures. Don't apologize for protecting your own. Outside, I finally picked up my phone. 38 missed calls already, most from Desmond, several from Priya, one from Maya. I didn't listen to the voicemails yet. I started the engine, and before I even backed out of the space, the phone rang again. I watched it vibrate until it stopped. Then again. I drove home without answering a single one. When I reached the house, Desmond's truck wasn't in the driveway. Neither was Priya's car. Maya sat at the kitchen island doing homework. Mom, are you okay? I will be, I told her. Dad left really fast, she said. He looked scared. Scared wasn't a word I usually associated with Desmond. An hour later, the front door burst open. Desmond walked in, pale, his shirt damp despite the air conditioning. Payroll didn't go through, he said. I know. The operating account, he struggled to finish. It's short, I know. Behind him, Priya rushed in, no longer smiling. What did you do? She demanded. I protected what belonged to me, I said. Desmond's phone rang again. His accountant. I watched every ounce of his confidence drain from his face as he listened. When he lowered the phone, his voice barely rose above a whisper. They're asking where the monthly transfers went. The room went completely still. For years, those transfers had appeared like clockwork. Nobody had ever wondered who funded them until they stopped. If you're still with me, this is where everything actually turns. Make sure you're subscribed, because what happened at that dining table an hour later changed the entire shape of our family. I walked upstairs without another word and came back down carrying a large gray file box, heavier than it looked. 17 years of paperwork weighs quite a bit. I set it on the dining table and opened the lid. Inside were neatly labeled folders, tax returns, mortgage statements, investment reports, business records, every emergency I'd quietly absorbed without ever asking for recognition. Open it, I told Desmond. He hesitated, then did. Payroll records from 4 years earlier, the January his company nearly lost 3 commercial contracts. You remember that January? I asked. It was awful. I figured out a way to cover it. I shook my head gently. No. I transferred $32,000 from my investment account. His eyebrows rose. I don't remember this. Because I never told you. Folder after folder told the same story. An IRS filing error I'd quietly resolved. A cashier's check from my own account. The down payment on our lake cabin, funded from my aunt's inheritance, rather than the business income Desmond had assumed, finally covered it. I never knew, he said. No, I told him. You never asked. One more folder specifically landed harder than any of the others. Near the bottom of the box was a folder labeled simply 2019, the year Desmond's company had nearly lost its largest commercial client over a scheduling dispute that threatened to bankrupt us entirely if it went to litigation. I'd quietly hired an attorney, paid her retainer from my own savings, and settled the dispute before Desmond even fully understood how serious it had become. You told me that resolved itself, he said, staring at the invoice. I let you believe that, I said, because you were already carrying enough that year, and I didn't think you needed to carry the fear of almost losing everything on top of it. He sat with that for a long moment, understanding, I think, for the first time, exactly how much I'd protected him from over the years, quietly, without ever asking for credit. Priya crossed her arms. So what? Married people help each other. I agree, I said evenly. That's exactly what I did. Then why are you acting like a victim? I looked at her. I'm not. I'm acting like someone who finally stopped being invisible. Maya and Julian walked in from a walk with the dog, sensing immediately that something had shifted. This is between adults, Priya said. Maya, 16 years old, surprised all of us. It became our business the moment you started treating Mom like she couldn't make her own decisions. The room froze. Julian spoke next, quieter. I remember the laptop. I thought maybe I shouldn't have asked for one. The guilt on Desmond's face became almost unbearable to watch. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I understood exactly what he was realizing. Our children had been quietly carrying weight they never should have had to carry. A moment with Maya later that same night, once things had settled enough for a quieter conversation, has stayed with me since. She found me in the kitchen, washing the dishes from a dinner nobody had really eaten, and she sat on the counter the way she'd done since she was small enough that I'd worried about her falling off. I've wanted to say something for a while, she told me. I just didn't know how. I asked her what she meant. I've watched Aunt Priya talk to you, like you don't know what you're doing with money, she said. And I've watched Dad just let her. I didn't understand why you never said anything back. I told her honestly that I hadn't fully understood it myself, not until that afternoon. I'm glad you finally did, she said, and hugged me in a way that told me she'd been carrying that observation, quietly, for longer than either of us had realized. Desmond stood and walked around the table until he stood directly in front of me. Why didn't you ever tell me all this? Because I thought we were a team. We were. Were we? I asked gently. Or was I just quietly cleaning up every mess while you believed you were carrying us alone? He didn't have an answer. I never wanted credit, I said. I only ever wanted respect. The story doesn't end at that dining table. Priya moved out to stay with a cousin 2 days later, chastened, but not yet fully accountable. Desmond didn't sleep much that first week, pacing downstairs most nights, carrying a different kind of burden than the unpaid invoices I'd learned to read in his walk over 17 years. This time it was regret. He called me the next morning and asked if we could really talk that evening. No yelling, no interruptions. I agreed, cautiously. When I got home, he was waiting on the back patio with 2 cups of untouched coffee. I owe you an apology, he said. I've heard that before, I told him honestly, usually just to end an argument. This time, I actually understand what I did, he said. You weren't spending my money. You were protecting our family, and I let my own sister convince me that protecting meant controlling. I told him plainly that being locked out of that card hadn't hurt, because I couldn't buy groceries. It hurt because my husband believed I needed permission at all. He cried, and I let him, and I told him I didn't expect forgiveness that same evening, because forgiveness isn't something that should be demanded. It has to grow. Priya called a week later and asked to come by. I almost said no. Instead, I remembered something my own father used to say. If people are willing to admit they were wrong, at least give them the chance to speak. She arrived carrying a small pie, the same gesture she'd made the first week she'd moved in with us, though she looked considerably older than she had a month earlier. I was terrified after my divorce, she admitted, twisting a tissue in her hands. I didn't know who I was anymore. I started giving advice because it made me feel useful, and somewhere along the way, I convinced myself my advice mattered more than yours. She looked at me directly. I was driving a wedge between the two of you, and I'm ashamed of that. More of what she said that evening added an unexpected layer to how I eventually understood her. You know what the worst part is? She said, staring at her hands. I spent 6 years married to a man who made every financial decision without consulting me, and when he left, I told myself I'd never let that happen to me again. And then I came into your house and did the exact same thing to you, from the other direction, because it was the only way I knew how to feel like I had any control over anything. I hadn't expected that framing, and I sat with it for a long moment, understanding, finally, that her overreach had come from the same wound as mine, a fear of being financially invisible in her own life, just aimed in a direction that had cost me instead of protecting her. I told her plainly what would need to change going forward if we were going to move forward at all, One shared household budget we both reviewed, separate personal accounts nobody needed permission to use, major decisions made together, and no more inserting herself into decisions that belonged to Desmond and me alone. She didn't argue. She simply accepted it, which told me more than any apology could have. Desmond surprised me a week after that, handing me a business card for a licensed marriage counselor. "I already made the appointment," he said. I laughed, genuinely, for the first time in weeks. That might be the smartest financial decision you've made all year. Our first session felt awkward, the two of us sitting on opposite ends of a gray sofa, while our therapist asked us each one question. "What did you lose?" she asked me. "My sense of being his partner," I said. She turned to Desmond. "I lost sight of the woman who'd been standing beside me the whole time," he answered. Neither answer fixed anything on its own, but for the first time in years, we were finally talking about feelings instead of finances, and I understood, sitting there, that money had never actually been the real problem. It had simply exposed a problem that had been quietly growing for years. I want to mention a specific exchange from a later session, because it reshaped how I understood the entire arc of what had happened. Our therapist, Dr. Anand, asked Desmond directly why he'd never once asked me how our household actually stayed afloat during the harder years. He sat with the question for a long time before answering. "I think some part of me didn't want to know," he admitted. "Knowing would have meant admitting I wasn't providing the way I thought a husband was supposed to. It was easier to just assume things worked out, and let my sister's version of helping fill in the gaps I didn't want to look at directly." I found that admission more useful than any apology, because it helped me understand that his blindness hadn't been simple carelessness. It had been a specific, protective avoidance of a truth he found threatening to his own sense of himself. Over the following months, we rebuilt something slower and more honest than what we'd had before. Every Sunday evening, we sat at the kitchen table and reviewed our finances together, not because either of us needed permission, but because we both deserved transparency. We kept one joint account for shared expenses and maintained our own personal accounts separately, and I stopped wondering, every single time I bought something small for myself, whether anyone would question it. Maya asked us to help her build a college budget one Saturday morning, and Desmond and I sat with both kids for an hour, talking honestly about credit, savings, and living within your means. I told them something I wished someone had told me years earlier, that the healthiest financial relationships are never built on who controls the money, but on honesty and shared responsibility. Months later, I found that sentence, written in Maya's own handwriting, taped inside her school planner. Priya changed too, slowly. She started volunteering at a community center a few weeks after moving out, organizing donation records, work that gave her something she'd apparently been missing, purpose that had nothing to do with our household. She still offers opinions occasionally, but now she waits until we ask, and when we tell her we've got it handled, she actually lets it go. Almost a year after the afternoon Desmond locked my card, we celebrated our 18th anniversary at the same small Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated our 10th. Over dessert, he slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was a replacement credit card. Not because I needed one, but because, as he put it, this one's different. It's not about spending. It's about trust. I think about that phone call often. The exact satisfaction in Priya's voice when she told me I'd now need her consent before spending my own money, certain, in that moment, that the two of them held every advantage in the room. What strikes me most, looking back, is that I never once needed to raise my voice to correct 17 years of being quietly taken for granted. I simply walked into a bank, told the truth on paper, and let 17 years of evidence speak for itself. I've thought a great deal, too, about the specific mechanics of how a pattern like that takes root in the first place. Priya's overreach didn't arrive as some sudden, calculated power grab. It arrived one small comment at a time, each one individually forgivable, each one easier to let go than to confront, until an entire family had quietly reorganized itself around her opinions without anyone ever consciously deciding that should happen. I think that's true of most controlling dynamics, whether they come from a mother-in-law, a sister-in-law, or anyone else who slips into a household during a moment of genuine need and never quite leaves the authority behind once the need has passed. The lesson I keep coming back to isn't really about Priya specifically. It's about how easily kindness, extended without boundaries, can be mistaken by the person receiving it for an open invitation to keep taking more. If you've ever spent years quietly holding a family together without asking for recognition, only to have someone decide, one afternoon, that you needed their permission to spend your own money, I hope you remember this. Peace and silence are not the same thing, and the strongest person in the room is often the one who never had to raise her voice to prove it. Thank you for spending this time with me. Tell me in the comments, has anyone ever mistaken your quiet strength for permission to control you? And if you haven't already, subscribe to Silent Revenge. New stories go up every week, and I don't want you to miss the next one. I'll see you there.